world today, as we speak, there's approximately 1.5 billion people who live in abject poverty. The World Bank defines abject poverty as living on $1.25 a day. About the cost, not even the cost of a cup of coffee in the morning. And so when we say abject poverty, we're talking about extreme malnutrition. We're talking about people who live without adequate sanitation. We're talking about folks who die from diseases that are completely treatable in Western societies. We're talking about people who don't have access to markets for their goods and services. If you extrapolate it on $1.25 a day and you said there's $2 a day, 2.5 billion people, almost half the world's population today lives on less than $2 a day. The World Bank is the lead institution in the international community that is devoted towards reducing and eliminating global poverty. It has a noble mission and it has dedicated staff. But it also has structural inefficiencies and a monolithic culture that impedes its effectiveness. And so the book that I wrote, The World Bank Unveiled, Inside the Revolutionary Struggle for Transparency, is an insider's perspective on how the World Bank operates and some potential ways to fix it. So my background is that I joined the World Bank in 1993 as a research assistant for a small team of environmental economists who were doing research on industrial pollution in the developing world. And they were trying to understand pollution abatement and pollution regulation issues as far as developing country environmental regulators were trying to implement them. And so one of the prevailing theories in economics in the early 1990s was that poor countries would accept pollution as the price that they would pay to improve their economies. And so we began doing some research, and some of the data that we uncovered showed that indeed in poor countries there were industrial facilities that were highly polluting. And in the absence of the ability for regulators to do traditional monitoring and enforcement of their country's regulations, that was quite understandable. But we also learned that there was a significant amount of manufacturers, factories, that were polluting at the standards of each country. And in fact, they were doing better than the standards. They were more green or cleaner than they had to be, given the fact that there was little enforcement capacity from these developing countries. We wondered, why would that be? And so what we learned was, in the absence of formal regulatory activities by environmental agencies, there were informal activities that were taking place. There were negotiations taking place between polluting facilities and communities through their representatives, either civil society actors or religious activists or other players that were compelling these polluting industries to pollute less than they could get away with. And we began to work with the government of Indonesia on an innovative pilot program on public information disclosure. The name of the program was called PROPER. And what we did with the environmental agency in Indonesia called Bapedal, we began collecting environmental data from polluting industries. And then what we would do with the agency was we began to analyze this information, and then we began to rank the information. So the performance of a polluting industry was given a 5-color rating. Essentially, it was below standards, at standards, or above standards. And then the concept of this pilot program was to release this information to the public through the media, television, radio, newspapers, and in the hopes that it would compel polluting industries to improve their performance. Because reputation counts, no matter what country you're in or what business you're in. You want to have a good reputation with your consumers and your constituents and in the communities that you operate in. So the first phase of the program was to collect the information, but we didn't release it, or the government didn't release it immediately. What they did was they went to the polluting industries and they informed them the ones that had not done so well in the analysis of their performance. And what we learned in the 6-month period prior to the release to the public of this information was a color rating. Essentially, it was below standards, at standards, or above standards. And then the concept of this pilot program was to release this information to the public through the media, television, radio, newspapers, and in the hopes that it would compel polluting industries to improve their performance. Because reputation counts, no matter what country you're in or what business you're in. You want to have a good reputation with your consumers and your constituents and in the communities that you operate in. So the first phase of the program was to collect the information, but we didn't release it, or the government didn't release it immediately. What they did was they went to the polluting industries and they informed them, the ones that had not done so well in the analysis of their performance. And what we learned in the 6-month period prior to the release to the public of this information was that polluting industries started to improve. For the first time, they began to understand what their pollution parameters were. And they began to realize that their reputations were going to be impacted by the public disclosure of this environmental performance. So we worked with the Indonesians for about 2 years on this proper program. And in the course of 2 years, pollution rates dramatically declined. There was a significant increase in environmental good behavior and adhering to Indonesian standards, and at very little cost to the environmental regulators. So we learned a very powerful lesson on the use of information disclosure. And so while we were doing our work on the environment, on informal regulatory activities that developing country environmental agencies could implement, there were also two very important trends that were occurring. The first was the rise of the internet and email communications. So what we did when the internet became a medium for mass communications, we were a small team of environmental researchers, and we realized the traditional way that we disseminated our research and our data sets is we would put together a draft paper, we would have it vetted by a small team, or a small circle of academics or fellow economists, and then we would hope to publish in a refereed journal. Now the internet gave us a dramatically different way of reaching audiences that we had never been able to communicate with. And so we built a website. It was called New Ideas in Pollution Regulation. And on this website, we put our papers and we put our data sets, and we did another very important thing. We asked folks who were outside the bank, who were doing research on this niche area of industrial pollution, to provide us with their information, and we would disseminate that to our audience. This is a very powerful driver of traffic. And over 4 years that we worked on this website, we had a philosophy of constantly providing new information and then sending out a newsletter to inform our community about it, and then providing a platform for other people who are doing environmental pollution research to provide their content so we could disseminate it out to our audiences. By the year 2000, we were ranked by an external vendor as the most important website that the World Bank had. We had captured 2% of their entire internet traffic. Now 2% doesn't sound like a lot, but you're talking about a niche subject, industrial pollution, and the World Bank had 1,000 sub-site competitors for us. So we were capturing quite a large amount of traffic because people really valued the content that we were providing them, and they knew that of all the places to get information on industrial pollution, albeit a very niche subject, this was the place to go. The other important trend that was happening during this period was the rise of civil society and its concern with institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, the World Bank had done some lending projects that had gone astray, most notably in India and Brazil. And the impact of these projects was to cause extreme degradation of forests, severe dislocation of indigenous populations, destruction of culture, and other harms. And so the World Bank began to take the perception among civil society actors as an organization or an institution that was not eradicating poverty as much as it was exacerbating poverty. And so this manifested itself into a growing protest movement. In 1994 in Madrid, the World Bank's annual meetings in Madrid were interrupted by protesters. In 1998, more protesters showed up in Washington. In 1999, there was a massive protest in Seattle against the World Trade Organization that turned violent. And so my colleagues and I were watching these developments, and we were very concerned that the violence of the civil society protesters might actually turn around and be directed towards the World Bank. So in 2000, the World Bank held its annual meetings. If you folks were in Washington at the time, you might remember that 20,000 protesters came to Washington, closed down the city for several days. Hundreds were arrested. Thousands stood outside our front door chanting, 50 years was enough. And indeed, 50 years might be enough if we were not able to change the image of people and people's perspectives about the World Bank. Inside the institution, my colleagues and I were looking at these developments, and we understood a couple of things. We understood the power of information disclosure, how information disclosure had changed people's behavior in Indonesia. One of the things I neglected to mention with our website was when we produced information, we were learning that environmental regulators from all over the world were looking at our environmental research and applying our pilot programs in their own local settings without our input. There's a second powerful lesson in information disclosure. So we're looking at these civil society protesters outside the World Bank, and we understood that we cared about the same things that they cared about. We didn't have a very good way of communicating with them, but in many ways we were as concerned about the issues plaguing the developing world and poverty as they were. And so we wanted to show them, humanize the World Bank, and we wanted to also share our knowledge about a variety of development issues that they didn't have access to. So with my colleague David Wheeler and I, we decided to launch a new website, and we called it B-SPAN. It was modeled on C-SPAN with the understanding that we would film policy dialogues taking place inside the World Bank that people outside the bank did not have access to. They were seminars, workshops, conferences on a variety of development topics where people who were experts from inside the World Bank or experts from outside the World Bank would come to the bank's headquarters and share their knowledge or share their research. Well, people outside the bank didn't have access to that information, and they certainly could use it. And so we wanted to provide a vehicle to share knowledge with them because they needed the knowledge, as well as humanize the World Bank, as well as provide people inside the World Bank an opportunity to reach out to external audiences and develop their own networks and constituencies. So we launched B-SPAN. We had two very important principles. The first was it would be completely transparent based on the C-SPAN model. We would have a camera that when the event began, we'd turn on the camera, and when the event ended, we turned off the camera. There was no censorship of any kind, no editing of any kind. So if you think about it, it's rather a remarkable thing, rather a remarkable accomplishment for the World Bank to host a medium where, in effect, somebody could stand up and criticize the World Bank on anything, and we would not censor that out. And this information is on a website going out to the public. So I think it's a huge feather in the World Bank's hat that we could do this. And so the other important principle is that we would permanently archive all our events in the hopes that it would become a library, a storehouse, a virtual storehouse of development knowledge that academics and scholars, historians, anybody who's interested in this content could access indefinitely. And over the course of the 5 years that we operated B-SPAN, we were supported by the vast majority of World Bank staff. Hundreds and hundreds of World Bankers participated in our broadcasts, watched watched our broadcast, supported this concept of transparency, and over the course of 5 years, we conducted more than 700 webcasts, completely unedited webcasts on a whole range of development topics. And again, we captured 2% of the bank's entire internet traffic. Now, the difference between the 2% here and the 2% in the environmental website, New Ideas in Pollution Regulation, was twofold. The way most people, if you do some research on how people use the internet, you will learn that most people visit a website for 30 seconds or 1 minute, and then they will move off. In B-SPAN, we were asking people to watch for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And the other important aspect was that to watch video content at that time, you had to download software that would allow you the playing of video and audio files. So when I say 2%, what I'm saying is that people really valued the content. They found it really important for them, and they were investing their time in a way that people would not invest on any other website. Well, by the end of 2004, we were attracting 250,000 viewers annually. So those are the folks who supported us. But there were some folks inside the World Bank, key power brokers, who adhered to the status quo, who were part of an internal culture that did not support knowledge sharing or information sharing. The culture of the World Bank is about hoarding information. It's about disseminating perfect information. It's about disseminating perfect information to selected audiences. What we were doing was completely the opposite. We were disseminating imperfect information to anybody who cared, anybody who wanted access. And so the story of the book that I wrote, The World Bank Unveiled, is really the story of how we put this communications medium together, and the personality struggle that is inherent in the World Bank, the one that believes in hoarding information and releasing perfect information, versus the part of the World Bank that understands its fallibility, knows it doesn't have all the answers, and supports a more transparent, accountable institution. B-SPAN served as that fault line. And so the book is really a story about how this struggle developed and what it means. And so when I left the World Bank in 2005, I took a step back and I had to ask myself, well, was this an isolated experience? Was it just the struggle that I had with a couple of bureaucrats who didn't view transparency and accountability the same way that I did? Or was it symptomatic of an institution? Was it more about, were there structural problems with the World Bank that were inherent with the institution, that were impeding its ability to be an efficient and effective mechanism in reducing global poverty? So I did some analysis and I learned some things. And so one of the things that I learned is in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in 2001, the rich countries of the world got together, first in Monterrey, Mexico in 2002, where they pledged to devote 0.7 of their GDP towards financial assistance to developing countries. And then in 2005, they got together in Gleneagles, Scotland, and pledged to devote 130 billion in aid specifically for, or essentially for sub-Saharan Africa. And then in 2008, the New York Times revealed research that, in fact, the rich countries of the world, the US, the Western Europeans, the Japanese, the Australians, had not, in fact, devoted 0.7 of their GDP towards reducing poverty in the developing world. They had, in fact, devoted 0.28 of their GDP. And the United States was last on that list at 0.16. And so, in fact, the World Bank, as the most important agency in the international community devoted towards reducing global poverty, had essentially failed during this period of 2002 to 2008 as a lobbyist on behalf of the poor people of the world. They made the case. They asked the rich countries of the world to devote more, but the rich countries did not. And I think there's basically three reasons why the World Bank was not an effective lobbyist during this period. The first is that there's a significant amount of research that both comes from within the World Bank and from outside the World Bank that the bank's lending is less than effective. It's not my research. I defer to the experts in this area who do study these issues, but there's significant concern that the bank's lending doesn't actually implement the outcomes it seeks to achieve. So if the World Bank's lending is not as effective as donors would like it to be, that it's very hard for the World Bank to go to the rich countries of the world and ask for more money for development assistance. The second reason that I think the World Bank was not effective is that it puts conditions on its lending. Some of these conditions were known as structural adjustment lending. And borrowing countries chafe at the conditionality of the bank's lending. They chafe because structural adjustment lending reduces public expenditures. It forces governments to privatize their public sectors. It reduces, it increases savings. Well, these might be sound macroeconomic conditions, but they often belie the political realities some of these countries are facing. And they reduce the safety nets that help the poorest of the poor. So as a result, borrowing countries don't like the conditions of the lending that the bank imposes, and they increasingly have been looking for alternative sources in the private sector. The third reason why I think the bank was not an effective advocate for the poor was that it has a monolithic culture, an aversion to openness, an inclination to be secretive, and as a result, donors, borrowers, and civil society actors tend to mistrust the World Bank. And if the bank is mistrusted, it makes it much more difficult for the institution to implement policies that it believes in the best interests of poor countries. So those were the conditions from 2002 to 2008. And then in 2008, we had the global economic